They offer you the world on a silver platter. A floating palace, they said, with an endless horizon. Now the horizon is a cage, and this palace is a tomb, whispering my name. I'm telling you this, not as a warning, but as an epitaph for the man I used to be. Because aboard the serenity of the seas, the dead don't rest. They perform. And my job is to be their solitary audience. This is the story of my first week, and the beginning of my end. The air in the night auditor's office tasted of three things: industrial-grade coffee, the faint, clean scent of ozone from the server racks, and the heavy, cloying smell of fear. I didn't recognize the last one at first. I mistook it for the lingering odor of the man I was replacing, a gaunt, sallow-skinned fellow named Arthur, whose handshake was as damp and limp as a dead fish. He moved with a skittish energy, his eyes constantly darting towards the polished brass clock on the wall, as if it were a ticking bomb. "The handover is simple," he'd said, his voice a dry rasp. "Log the day's earnings, reconcile the accounts from the casinos and boutiques, and keep an eye on the security monitors. The ship is your kingdom from midnight to sunrise." It sounded like a dream. I'd taken the job to escape a life that had been systematically dismantled by debt and disappointment. On land, I was a failure, a ghost in my own apartment. But here on the MS Serenity of the Seas, a behemoth of steel and light, I could be anonymous. I could be the quiet guardian of a sleeping city, gliding silently over the black, infinite ocean. The pay was obscenely good, enough to rebuild my life from the ground up. The only catch was that the contract was for a full year, no shore leave for the first 6 months. I signed without a second thought. I had nothing to go back to anyway. "That's everything," Arthur said, sliding a thick binder across the desk. He then paused, his hand hovering over a simple manila folder next to it. He looked at me, and for the first time, his frantic gaze settled. There was a profound pity in his eyes that made my skin crawl. And then, "There's this." He pushed the folder towards me. It was thin, unmarked. "Read it. Learn it. Memorize it. Don't try to understand it. Don't try to rationalize it. Just follow the rules. To the letter." He looked at the clock again. 11:58 p.m. His relief was so palpable it was almost a physical force pushing him out of his chair. "Don't get curious, Alex. Curiosity on this ship is an anchor. It will drag you down to the places where the light doesn't reach." And then he was gone. I watched him on the small security monitor next to the door, practically sprinting down the pristine, deeply carpeted corridor of Deck 3, the service level known as the engine. He didn't look back. Alone, the silence of the ship settled around me. It was a profound quiet I'd never experienced, not the absence of noise, but a presence in itself. I could hear the deep, rhythmic hum of the engines far below, a vibration that felt like the ship's own heartbeat. I could hear the gentle creak of the superstructure as it flexed against the pressure of the Atlantic. I took a deep breath, the coffee-scented air filling my lungs. This was it, my new beginning. For the first hour, I felt a sense of peace. I followed the procedures in the main binder. The work was methodical, calming. Numbers on a screen, columns that had to balance. It was logical. It was sane. The security monitors showed a silent, still world. Empty ballrooms with chandeliers glittering like constellations of frozen stars. A vast moonlit pool deck. The water, a sheet of black glass. Miles of corridors, each one identical to the last. Their plush carpets and soft golden lighting stretching into the distance like a recurring dream. I was the only conscious mind in a 10-story, quarter-mile-long floating palace, home to 5,000 sleeping souls. The feeling was intoxicating. Around 1:30 a.m., my curiosity finally got the better of me. I opened the manila folder. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It felt old. The edges softened and yellowed with age, a stark contrast to the crisp, white corporate letterhead in the main binder. It was typed, clearly from an old-fashioned typewriter, the ink slightly faded, some letters striking harder than others. At the top, in stark, simple capitals, were the words, "Essential rules for the night shift. Do not disregard." I smirked. A hazing ritual. Classic. Every unique job has its little traditions, its pranks to spook the new guy. I leaned back in my chair, ready for a laugh. I read the list. The ship is quiet at night, but it is never silent. Learn the difference between the sounds of the ship and the sounds on the ship. All standard security patrols are to be conducted via CCTV. Do not, under any circumstances, leave the office to investigate an anomaly in person between the hours of 1 a.m. and 5 a.m. If you hear the sound of a waltz melody coming from the pool deck, deck 12, after 2 a.m., ignore it. The PA system is shut down for maintenance during these hours. The pool is always empty at night. Do not go to verify. The elevator in the grand atrium is programmed to run a diagnostic cycle at 3:15 a.m. It will sometimes stop on deck 8. The doors will open. No one will be inside. Do not watch it for more than a few seconds. Look away. Occasionally, the cameras in the grand ballroom may capture a figure in a red evening gown. This is a known digital artifact, a ghost image caused by a wiring flaw. Reboot the monitor feed for that camera immediately. Do not attempt to zoom in. Do not watch the artifact for more than 5 seconds. If a telephone in an unoccupied cabin rings to your desk, do not answer it. Note the cabin number in the log and let it ring until it stops on its own. Do not consume any food or drink left unattended in the break room after midnight, even if it has your name on it. If you hear a child crying over the comms system, report it as radio interference in the morning log. There are no children registered among the resident crew on this voyage. Do not respond. By the time I finished the list, I wasn't laughing anymore. The sheer specificity of it was unsettling. It wasn't the vague, watch out for the ghost of old Captain Jack nonsense I'd expected. It was a list of precise, bizarre, and utterly insane operating procedures. A wiring flaw that looks like a woman in a red dress? A waltz from a dead sound system? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the previous auditors were all on drugs. Or maybe this was the most elaborate, long-running prank in maritime history. I tossed the sheet onto the desk, shaking my head with a chuckle that sounded hollow even to my own ears. A prank. It had to be. I turned my attention back to the monitors, my eyes scanning the endless empty spaces. The grand ballroom, the atrium, the pool deck, all silent, all still. I focused on my work, the comforting logic of the numbers a welcome distraction. At 2:17 a.m. it happened. It was faint at first, so faint I thought I was imagining it. A thin, tinny thread of music weaving through the low hum of the ship. I paused, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I tilted my head, listening. It was music, a slow, elegant, 3/4 time signature. A waltz. My blood ran cold. My eyes snapped to the bank of monitors. I unmuted the audio feed for the pool deck. The sound became clearer, unmistakable now. It was a beautiful, melancholic piano waltz, the kind you'd hear in an old black and white film. It sounded like it was coming from very far away, yet it was crystal clear through the speakers. I stared at the camera feed for deck 12. The pool was a placid, dark mirror reflecting the cold, distant stars. The lounge chairs were empty, their shadows long and skeletal in the moonlight. Nothing was moving. Nothing was there. Yet the music played on, a phantom orchestra for an audience of none. Rule 3. Ignore it. The pool is always empty at night. Do not go to verify. My heart was hammering against my ribs. A prank. It's just a prank. Someone is messing with me. A veteran crew member with access to the audio systems is having a laugh at the new guy's expense. It was the only logical explanation. But the explanation did nothing to slow my heart rate. The music was deeply, profoundly sad. It felt ancient. I muted the feed, the abrupt silence in the office somehow more deafening than the music had been. I tried to focus on my work, but my eyes kept darting back to the monitors. Every shadow looked menacing. Every flicker of a light felt like a prelude to something terrible. The sheer scale of the ship, which had once felt like a symbol of freedom, now felt like a cage. A vast floating prison, and I was the only one awake. I decided to cycle through the main cameras just to reassure myself. Casino. Empty rows of slot machines, their lights blinking in silent, cheerful patterns. Theater. A cavern of plush red velvet seats facing a dark, empty stage. Promenade deck. A ghost town of closed-up luxury shops. Then I switched to the grand ballroom. For a moment, everything was normal. The cavernous room was empty. its polished dance floor gleaming under the dimmed light of the colossal crystal chandeliers. I scanned the room, from the stage at one end to the sweeping staircase at the other. Nothing. I was about to switch to the next camera when I saw it, a flicker of movement near the base of the staircase. I leaned closer to the screen, my breath catching in my throat. What was that? A trick of the light? A reflection? I held my breath and watched. For a full minute, nothing happened. I was about to dismiss it, to blame my frayed nerves, when it happened again. A flash of crimson, just a blur, gone as quickly as it appeared. My mind screamed. Rule 5. Occasionally, the cameras in the grand ballroom may capture a figure in a red evening gown. A wiring flaw. Reboot the monitor feed. Do not watch. For more than 5 seconds. But I couldn't look away. It was like my eyes were glued to the screen. My hand hovered over the mouse, wanting to zoom in, to prove to myself that it was just a glitch. The rational part of my brain was being drowned out by a primal, morbid curiosity. I stared, unblinking, at the spot where I'd seen the color. 1 second. 2. 3. 4. On the 5th second, it wasn't a blur. For a single heart-stopping frame, the image resolved. It was a woman, tall and impossibly slender, standing perfectly still at the bottom of the staircase. She was wearing a floor-length evening gown, the color of fresh blood. Her back was to the camera, but her head was tilted slightly, as if she were listening to the last echoes of a forgotten song. The image flickered, distorted, and then she was gone. I yelped, shoving my chair back so hard it slammed into the wall behind me. My heart felt like it was going to explode. I scrambled for the mouse, my trembling fingers fumbling with the controls. I clicked the icon to reboot the camera feed. The screen went black for a moment before the image of the empty ballroom returned. It was just as it was before, silent, still, empty. But it wasn't empty. I knew it wasn't. I spent the next hour in a state of heightened terror, unable to work, unable to look away from the screens. I felt watched. The hundreds of cameras weren't my eyes on the ship anymore. They were its eyes on me. The ship was alive, and it was testing me. The rules weren't a prank. They were a survival guide. Just as a sliver of my rationality began to return, just as I started to convince myself that I was exhausted, overworked, and hallucinating, the phone on my desk rang. The sound was a shrill, piercing shriek that cut through the oppressive silence of the office. It was an old-fashioned ring, not the digital chirp of a modern phone system. I stared at it, my body frozen in a new kind of fear. It was a multi-line phone, and the little red light blinking next to one of the buttons indicated an internal call. Beside the light, a small digital screen displayed the origin of the call. My eyes struggled to focus on the glowing green letters. Cabin 719. Rule 6. If a telephone in an unoccupied cabin rings to your desk, do not answer it. My hands shook as I navigated to the ship's manifest on my computer. I typed in the cabin number. The result flashed on the screen, each word a nail in the coffin of my sanity. Cabin 713. Status: unoccupied. Access restricted due to ongoing maintenance. The phone continued its relentless, shrieking summons. Ring, pause, ring, pause. It echoed in the small office, a sound that didn't belong, a question being asked from an impossible place. Every ring is a dare, a question. Do I follow the rules of the company or the rules on this yellowed piece of paper? I don't know what's real anymore, and I'm 500 miles from the nearest shore. If you want to know what I chose, what was waiting on the other end of that line, make sure you subscribe and hit that like button. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. The phone rang 13 times. I know because I counted. Each shriek was a physical blow, a sonic assault that seemed to make the very air in the office vibrate. My hand was a knot of white knuckles on the desk, my entire being focused on the singular, monumental effort of not reaching for the receiver. The list of rules lay next to the phone, its typed letters seeming to glow with malevolent wisdom. Do not answer it. It was the only scripture I had in this new, unholy church of steel and sea. On the 13th ring, it stopped. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was heavier, more profound than anything that had come before. It was a weighted blanket of quiet, pressing down on me, thick with unspoken threats. I checked the computer screen again, my eyes burning from staring at it. Cabin 7113, status, unoccupied. The words hadn't changed. The call had come from an empty room. The rest of my shift passed in a fugue state of hypervigilance. I abandoned all pretense of work. The numbers and ledgers on my main screen seemed like relics from a different reality, a world of logic and reason that I was no longer a part of. My world was now the bank of 16 monitors displaying the silent, sleeping sections of the ship. But they weren't sleeping. I knew that now. The ship was awake and it was watching me through its myriad glass eyes. The red recording light on each camera, once a symbol of security, now felt like the predatory glint in the eye of some great, unseen beast. I was inside it, a Jonah in the belly of a mechanical leviathan, and I was beginning to suspect there was no way out. When the sun finally rose, the change was jarring. The first rays of dawn spilling over the horizon felt like a benediction, a fragile truce. Soon, the ship began to stir. The quiet hum was replaced by 1,000 other sounds. The distant clatter of the galley preparing for breakfast, the cheerful chime of the elevators, the first announcements from the cruise director crackling over the PA system. The night's oppressive atmosphere didn't vanish, but it receded. It pulled back into the shadows, into the service corridors and maintenance shafts waiting. When my replacement, a bright-eyed day auditor named Maria, arrived at 8 West AM, the smile I gave her felt like a mask I had to physically hold in place. She bustled in, smelling of fresh coffee and morning optimism, and the contrast with my own state, sweating, sleepless, and smelling of pure distilled dread, was almost comical. "Rough first night?" she asked, her voice a little too loud in the quiet office. "It takes some getting used to. The quiet can play tricks on you." This was my chance, my opportunity to see if I was truly alone in this. I tried to sound casual, nonchalant. "Yeah, it's something else. The systems are a bit quirky too. Kept hearing feedback, faint music over the comms from the pool deck, I think." Maria's smile didn't falter, but it tightened at the edges. It was an infinitesimal change, a micro-expression of practiced dismissal that I would have missed if I wasn't scrutinizing her every move. "Ah, that. It's the cross-wiring with the ship's ambient audio. Old vessel, you know, full of quirks. You learn to tune it out." She said the word quirks as if it were a perfectly wrapped gift, offered to placate a curious child. It was a lie, and we both knew it. I decided to push a little harder, the desperation in me overriding my caution. "And the cameras have some ghosting issues, the one in the ballroom especially." This time, her cheerful facade cracked for a split second. A flicker of something cold and hard passed through her eyes before being instantly suppressed. She busied herself with logging into the system, her back partially to me. "Maintenance has been meaning to look at that for years. Just reboot the feed if it acts up. You'll find most problems on this ship can be solved by either ignoring them or turning them off and on again." She laughed. It was a brittle, hollow sound. The conversation was over. The wall was up. That interaction set the template for my entire day. I was living in a different reality from the 5,000 other people on board. For them, this was a floating paradise of buffets, deck chairs, and duty-free shopping. For me, it was a haunted house I couldn't escape. I tried to talk to other long-serving crew members, weaving my questions into casual conversation. I asked a bartender at the Calypso bar about old ship traditions. He just polished a glass, his knuckles white, and told me, "The best tradition on the Serenity is keeping your head down and your mouth shut. You get paid well for a reason, mate." I spoke to a weathered deckhand who was securing lines near the stern. When I mentioned strange noises at night, he stopped coiling his rope and looked me dead in the eye, his face as grim as the churning grey water behind him. "Some things on this ship are older than the steel, son. They were here long before us, and they'll be here long after. They don't like being noticed, remember that." The message was unambiguous. There was a conspiracy of silence, an unspoken agreement among the crew to deny, deflect, and discourage. They were all participants, either willingly or through fear, in upholding the fragile illusion of normalcy. And I, the newcomer, was a threat to that illusion. I was utterly, terrifyingly alone. That night, I returned to the office with a knot of dread in my stomach. The sun set, and with it the ship's cheerful mask was removed. The silence descended once more, and I knew I was in for another test. The waltz began earlier this time, at 1:45 a.m. It was louder, less ethereal. It no longer sounded like a distant memory, but like a live performance, the phantom pianist's fingers dancing across the keys with a renewed confidence. And it wasn't just coming from the pool deck anymore. I could hear it faintly on the feeds for the atrium, the casino, and even the eerily silent promenade. It was as if the music was bleeding through the ship's architecture, a spreading stain of wrongness. Then came the lady in red. I was forcing myself to cycle through the cameras, my movements jerky and paranoid when I saw her again. This time she wasn't in the ballroom. She was standing in the middle of the main thoroughfare on Deck 6, a long corridor lined with portraits of the ship's past captains. I had walked down that exact corridor less than an hour ago, on my way to the break room. The camera's timestamp confirmed it. She had appeared in a place I had just been. My blood turned to ice. This wasn't a random glitch. This wasn't a residual haunting, a memory trapped in a loop. This was intelligent. It was aware. It knew where I was. It was following me. I stared, mesmerized by the sheer audacity of it, the sheer impossibility. 4 seconds passed. On the 5th, her head, which had been facing away, began to turn slowly, unnaturally, towards the camera. I slammed the reboot button before I could see her face, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The screen went black. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the crushing silence. This entity, this phenomenon, wasn't just a part of the ship's nightly routine. It was interacting with me. It was studying me. The rules weren't just a list of things to avoid, they were the parameters of a game, and I was the unwilling player. By the 3rd night, my curiosity had metastasized into a desperate, gnawing need for answers. The crew wouldn't talk. The rules offered no explanations. I was trapped in a cage with a monster I couldn't see, and my only hope of survival was to understand the nature of my prison. If the ship's crew were a dead end, I would turn to the ship itself. As night auditor, I had high-level clearance to the ship's integrated computer system, not just the financial records, but the operational archives, the maintenance logs, the digital skeleton of the vessel. After midnight, I began to dig. I started with the obvious, cabin 713. The official record was sparse, a minor electrical fire 3 years ago. Since then, it had been listed as under permanent refurbishment. A lie. 3 years to refurbish a single cabin? No, it was quarantined, walled off. Next, I searched for the grand ballroom. I cross-referenced maintenance logs with the dates of any guest complaints about the camera systems. I found a pattern. Every few years, there were work orders to replace the entire CCTV wiring for the ballroom. The reason cited was always vague. Persistent signal degradation. Another lie. They weren't fixing a flaw. They were trying and failing to excise a ghost from the machine. My search became more frantic. I felt like I was racing against time, that the ship itself knew what I was doing and would soon move to stop me. I widened my search terms. Anomaly, incident, unexplained. Most were dead ends, but then I found it. Buried deep in a decommissioned server, accessible only through an old command line interface, was a folder labeled Maiden Voyage Archives, Restricted. My fingers trembled as I typed in my highest level access code. Access denied. I tried another, a legacy administrator password I'd found in the back of the binder. Access granted. The folder contained scanned documents from the ship's maiden voyage, over 60 years ago. Press releases, menus, passenger lists, all celebrating the launch of the most luxurious ocean liner ever built. It was a vessel of hope and progress, the serenity of the seas. I scrolled through faded black and white photographs of smiling, elegantly dressed people dancing in the grand ballroom, lounging by the pool, a world away from the silent, menacing place I now inhabited. I kept digging, opening archived internal memos, and then I found the file that changed everything. It was a scanned newspaper clipping from a small local paper, dated the final day of the maiden voyage. The headline was stark: Tragedy Mars Serenity's Inaugural Journey. My breath hitched. The article was brief, heavily sanitized. It mentioned a minor electrical fire that broke out in a service closet near the Grand Ballroom during the final night's captain's gala. It reported a few injuries due to smoke inhalation and praised the crew for their swift and professional response. It was a footnote, a small blip in an otherwise triumphant story, but below the official article was a series of internal corporate memos. They told a different story. The fire wasn't minor. It had ripped through a section of the ballroom, causing a panic. The ship's state-of-the-art sprinkler system had malfunctioned. In the ensuing chaos and smoke, several people had been trapped. The memos spoke of a cover-up, of settling with families out of court, of scrubbing the official records to protect the company's new flagship investment. And then I found the casualty list. It was a simple, typed document, never meant for public eyes. 10 names. 10 souls whose deaths had been erased from their own ship's history. I read through them, my heart growing heavier with each one. And then I saw the final name on the list, and the world fell out from under me. Lady Annabel Clayton. Cause of death: smoke inhalation. Last seen Grand Ballroom staircase. Attached to the file was a low-resolution scan of a society page photo. It showed a young woman, breathtakingly beautiful, descending a grand staircase. The caption read, "Lady Annabel Clayton stuns at the captain's gala in her signature crimson gown." The woman in the red dress wasn't a wiring flaw. She was a memory, a scar, a ghost, trapped forever in the place where her life had been stolen. I sat back, the truth washing over me in a cold, sickening wave. The waltz, the gala, the fire. It was all connected. This ship wasn't just haunted. It was wounded, carrying the silent scream of that night within its very structure. I had to know more. I navigated back to the maiden voyage crew manifest. I scrolled down the list of positions, my eyes scanning for one in particular. And there it was, Night Auditor. The name next to it was Thomas Granger, a name that meant nothing to me. Just as I was about to close the file, my office lights flickered violently. They buzzed, dimmed to a dull orange glow, and then went out completely, plunging me into absolute darkness. My screens died, their reassuring glow extinguished, leaving me blind. The only sound was the thumping of my own heart and the deep, ceaseless hum of the ship. I was frozen in my chair, my senses screaming. The air grew cold, a damp, cellar-like chill that had no business being in a climate-controlled office. I held my breath listening, and then I heard it. It wasn't a sound from the speakers or over the comms, it was inside the office with me, a soft rustling sound, like silk brushing against a wall. It was close, too close. Then came the whisper. It was a woman's voice, faint and laced with an ancient sorrow, yet it was as clear as if her lips were pressed directly against my ear. It was a single, ethereal word, a name spoken from the abyss of 60 years past. Thomas. The name hung in the freezing, pitch-black air of the office. Thomas. It was spoken with a breathy, intimate sorrow, a lover's lament whispered across a 60-year abyss. My entire nervous system short-circuited. I was no longer a man sitting in a chair. I was a live wire of pure, unadulterated terror. The sound of rustling silk seemed to encircle me, a dry, whispering cyclone in the suffocating darkness. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. My throat had closed up, trapping the sound in my lungs which burned for air. I was convinced a spectral hand was about to close over my face, its touch both impossibly cold and searingly hot. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. With a loud electrical thump from the server rack, the lights flickered back to life, buzzing erratically before settling into their normal, sterile hum. My computer monitors blinked on one by one, displaying their silent, empty tableaus. The air warmed instantly, the unnatural chill dissipating like morning fog. The sound of silk was gone. The whisper was gone. I remained frozen for what felt like an eternity, every muscle in my body locked tight. My first ragged gasp for air was a raw, guttural sound, halfway between a sob and a choke. I scanned the office frantically. Everything was exactly as I had left it. The door was still closed and locked. The vents were screwed tightly into the ceiling. There was nowhere for a sound or a person to have come from, but she had been there. Not on a screen, not as a disembodied sound from a distant deck. She had been in the room with me. She had crossed a fundamental boundary, and in doing so, had shattered the last vestiges of my denial. This was not a story I was uncovering, it was a story I was now a part of, and she had mistaken me for someone else. Thomas, the night auditor from the maiden voyage. Did she think I was him? Or did she know I wasn't, and was using his name to terrorize me? Which possibility was worse? The rest of the night was a lost cause. I couldn't focus on anything but the memory of that voice, the feel of that cold. I spent the hours until dawn with my back pressed into the corner of the room, my eyes wide, watching the door and the vents, a cornered animal waiting for the predator to return. It did not. The daylight hours brought no relief. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the flash of a crimson dress. I heard the whisper of a dead man's name. During my off hours, I walked the passenger decks, a ghost among the living. The ship was a festival of manufactured joy. Families laughed by the pool. Couples held hands watching the endless blue horizon. The sound of a live steel drum band creating a vibrant, carefree atmosphere. It all felt like a grotesque parody. These people were living in the sunlit penthouse of a skyscraper, completely oblivious to the festering, lightless catacombs in the foundation. Their laughter felt like an insult. Their ignorance, a luxury I would never know again. I saw a little girl drop her ice cream cone and burst into tears, her mother immediately scooping her up into a hug. A simple, everyday tragedy. I felt an overwhelming urge to grab the mother by the shoulders and scream, "That isn't real sadness. You don't know what sadness is, you don't know where you are." I was becoming unhinged. The line between my night of terror and my day of supposed rest was dissolving. The ship's influence was no longer confined to the darkness. It was seeping into my waking thoughts, poisoning my perception of reality. On my fourth night, I returned to my post, a changed man. The curiosity was gone, replaced by a grim, teeth-grinding resolve. The fear was still there, a constant, cold companion, but it was now mingled with a sliver of anger. I was not Thomas. My name is Alex. And this entity, this sorrowful ghost or whatever it was about to learn that. I sat at my desk, the list of rules laid out before me. I had followed them to the letter. I had ignored the waltz, rebooted the camera, refused the call. What had it gotten me? An escalation, a personal visit. It was clear that being a passive observer wasn't a guarantee of safety. The game was changing and I didn't even know the objective. That night, the waltz didn't play. The woman in red did not appear on any of the monitors. The phone from cabin 713 remained silent. The ship was quiet, deathly quiet. It was, I realized with a fresh wave of nausea, even more terrifying than the activity. The silence felt deliberate. It was the held breath before the pounce. It was watching me, waiting for me to lower my guard. I spent hours staring at the screens, my nerves stretched to their breaking point, but nothing happened. Just as I was beginning to think the night might pass without incident, a new sound began. It wasn't from the ship's systems. It was from the corridor right outside my office door. It was the soft, gentle, melodic humming of a lullaby. My heart seized. It wasn't just any lullaby. I knew it instantly. It was the one my mother used to hum to me when I was a child, sick with a fever. A simple, tuneless little melody she had made up herself, one that nobody else in the world could possibly know. It was a memory so private, so deeply buried, I hadn't thought of it in 20 years. The humming was coming from directly outside my locked door. It was a woman's voice, soft and soothing, yet it was the most obscene sound I had ever heard. This thing had been inside my head. It had sifted through my memories, found the warmest, most treasured one, and was now wearing it like a costume. It was defiling my past, turning my own love and nostalgia into a weapon against me. This is a test, I thought, my mind racing. It's trying to get me to break rule number 2, do not leave the office to investigate. The humming stopped. It was replaced by a soft, hesitant scratching at the door. Scratch, 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 like a small animal wanting to be let in. Then, a voice, a perfect imitation of my mother's, right down to the slight tremor she developed in her later years. "Alex, "Honey, are you in there? I'm cold. Please open the door." I clapped my hands over my mouth to stifle a scream. It was a flawless mimicry. The entity wasn't just a ghost trapped in a loop of its own tragedy anymore. It was a predator, a parasite that could learn, adapt, and use its victim's own emotions as bait. It was using the memory of my dead mother to try and lure me out into the hallway. The sheer, calculated cruelty of it left me breathless. I stayed huddled in my corner, tears of rage and terror streaming down my face, until the sun finally rose and the scratching stopped. I knew then that I couldn't survive this by being passive. Arthur, my predecessor, hadn't quit. He had fled, he had escaped, and he must have known more than he let on. There had to be something he left behind, some clue, some warning beyond that single sheet of rules. That afternoon, fueled by a dangerous cocktail of caffeine and desperation, I began to tear the auditor's office apart. It wasn't a methodical search, it was a frantic, destructive rampage. I emptied every drawer, riffled through every file, checked behind the server racks and inside the ceiling panels. Nothing, just standard corporate equipment and years of accumulated dust. I was about to give up, to collapse in a heap of despair, when my eyes fell on the floor. The office was carpeted with industrial-grade tiles, but one directly under the desk sat just slightly askew. My heart hammering, I knelt and pried at its edge with my fingers. It came loose with a soft tearing sound. Underneath, set into the concrete subfloor, was a small square panel of metal with a recessed handle. A maintenance hatch. I pulled it open. Inside the small dark cavity was a single object, a small black leather-bound journal, held shut by a rotting elastic band. My hands trembled as I lifted it out. It smelled of dust, mildew, and stale fear. I opened it. The first page had a name written in a shaky, spidery script: Arthur Pinner, Night Auditor. The date of the first entry was exactly 1 year before I had started. He had lasted his full contract. I sat down and began to read. The journal was my own nightmare, written in another man's hand. The early entries described the same sense of wonder and isolation I had felt. Then came the first mention of the rules, which he too had dismissed as a prank. Then, the waltz, the lady in red, the phone call from cabin 713. He described them with a chilling familiarity. But as I read further, his entries became more erratic, more desperate. He was documenting an escalation far beyond what I had yet experienced. Entry 47. She's learning. Last night, she didn't just stand on the staircase, she walked down it. One step at a time, she stopped at the bottom and looked directly at camera 4. I rebooted the feed, but I can't get the image out of my head. There was nothing in her eyes, just emptiness. Entry 62. The rules are all that matter. I broke one. I answered the phone. There was only static, and then a sound like water, and a little girl crying for her mother. I hung up, but I could still hear the crying in my head for hours. The next night, the water heaters on Deck 7 burst, flooded the whole corridor. The official report said it was a pressure failure. I know what it was. I angered the ship. I flipped through the pages, my horror mounting with each entry. Then I found the passage that made my blood run cold. Entry 98. I was wrong about everything. I thought this was a haunting, a residual energy. It's not. It's a system. It's a performance. And the rules are its stage directions. I saw her up close last night, not on a camera. She was in the atrium by the glass elevator. I don't think she saw me. She was just waiting for her cue. I've come to a terrible conclusion. She doesn't hunt, she tests. She's looking for something or someone. Then a few pages later, the most terrifying revelation of all. Entry 114. I spoke to one of the old engineers today, a man named Sergei who is retiring soon. He got drunk and told me things. He said the rules aren't for our protection. Not really. They are to ensure the performance is not interrupted. They are to protect her, to keep the audience member from climbing onto the stage. We are the audience. Our presence, our attention, is what gives the show power. We are the silent witness. Without us, the memory fades. My mind reeled. An audience? A performance? It was an insane, terrifying thought. We weren't security. We were anchors. Human anchors for a supernatural ritual taking place every single night. I turned to the last page. The handwriting was almost illegible, a frantic scrawl of someone on the verge of total collapse. The ink was smeared in places, as if by tears or sweat. The cycle requires a guardian, that's what Sergei whispered. It's not a job, it's a sentence. She has to have her audience. I can't do it anymore. She knows my name. She knows all our names. I found a replacement. A poor soul from the mainland looking for an escape. He has no idea he's not escaping to something. He's escaping into it. I pray he's stronger than I am. Or maybe I pray he fails the tests quickly. I don't know which is more merciful. The only way out is to find someone else to watch the show. Whatever you do, new man, don't break the rules. Don't let her see you. Don't become part of the performance, because there are no empty roles in this play. If you step on stage, you will be given a part, and you will play it forever. I closed the journal, my hands shaking so violently I could barely hold it. Arthur hadn't escaped. He had just passed the torch. He had found his replacement. Me. I wasn't an employee. I was the next sacrifice, chosen to sit in the dark and bear witness so that a 60-year-old tragedy could play itself out, night after night. And the most terrifying part, the part that echoed in the deepest recesses of my soul, was his final warning. Don't become part of the performance. What in God's name did that mean? What happens when the audience joins the cast? Holding Arthur's journal was like holding a live grenade. The flimsy, rotting elastic band seemed to be the only thing containing a truth so explosive it could shatter a man's sanity. For a long moment after reading that final, desperate entry, I didn't move. I simply sat on the cold floor of the auditor's office, the black book resting in my lap, and felt the last of my old self drain away. The man who had boarded this ship seeking a new start was gone, replaced by a stranger whose only inheritance was a legacy of fear. Arthur hadn't just passed the torch, he had passed the sentence. A new emotion began to crystallize amidst the terror, something cold and hard and sharp. Rage. It was a clean, purifying fury. I had been lied to. I had been lured into a gilded cage and sold a ticket to my own damnation. My anger wasn't just directed at the spectral performers of the nightly horror show. It was aimed squarely at the living, breathing men and women who polished the bars of my prison, who smiled and served drinks and collected paychecks while knowing what festered in the ship's heart when the lights went down. They weren't just complicit, they were accessories. I placed the journal back in its hiding spot and replaced the floor tile. It was my only piece of evidence, my only proof that I wasn't losing my mind. It was my secret weapon. As I stood up, a plan, born of desperation and fury, began to form. I was done being the passive audience. I was done being the rat in the maze. I was going to confront the zookeeper. My target was a man named Mr. Davies, the head of onboard operations. He was a stern, immaculately dressed man with the kind of practiced corporate charm that never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. He was the one who had interviewed me, the one whose signature was next to mine on the contract. He was the gatekeeper. I waited until mid-afternoon when the ship was at its most vibrant, its illusion of carefree paradise at its most potent. I walked through the grand atrium, a soaring 10-story space of glass elevators, shimmering gold fixtures, and a constant, cheerful hum of activity. The juxtaposition was dizzying. People were taking selfies, sipping champagne, their faces alight with vacation bliss. They were standing in the very spot where I knew a phantom presence waited for its cue, and the sheer, staggering ignorance of it all made me want to vomit. Mr. Davies' office was on the executive deck, a hushed, deeply carpeted sanctuary far from the plebeian noise. His secretary, a woman with a smile as artificial as the silk flowers on her desk, tried to stop me. "Mr. Davies is in a meeting. Do you have an appointment?" "He'll see me," I said, my voice having a harder edge than I'd ever heard it possess. I walked past her and knocked once on the heavy, polished mahogany door before letting myself in. Davies was sitting behind a desk the size of a small boat, a scale model of the serenity of the seas displayed proudly behind him. He looked up, his expression of annoyance instantly melting into one of professional concern when he saw the state of me. I probably looked like a ghost myself, unshaven, my eyes wide and bloodshot from lack of sleep. "Alex," he said, steepling his fingers. "Is there a problem? The day auditor hasn't reported any issues with your reconciliations." "My reconciliations are fine," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "It's the other duties, the ones that weren't in the job description." Davy's smile remained fixed, but a shutter came down over his eyes. "I'm not sure I follow. The role is quite straightforward." "The waltz on the pool deck," I said, listing the plagues of my nights. "The wiring flaw in the ballroom, the calls from empty cabins, the rules. I want to talk about the rules." He leaned back in his chair, the picture of calm executive composure. He sighed, a soft, patronizing sound. "Every ship has its ghosts, Alex. Stories, traditions. Sailors are a superstitious lot. You've been working long hours. The isolation can get to you. I'm sure if you just..." I found Arthur's journal. The name hit him like a physical blow. For a fraction of a second, the mask of control vanished completely. I saw a flash of raw, undiluted panic in his eyes, a look I recognized because I had been wearing it myself for days. Then, it was gone, expertly suppressed. He straightened his tie. The temperature in the room seemed to drop by 20 degrees. "I see," he said, his voice now flat, devoid of its earlier warmth. He gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "Sit down, Alex." I sat, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. This was it. The curtain was being pulled back. Davy stared at me for a long time, his gaze evaluative as if he were assessing a critical system failure. "Let me be very clear about what happens now," he began, his voice low and precise. "I am not admitting to anything. We are going to have a hypothetical conversation about the unique operational challenges of a vessel with a certain historical pedigree. What is said in this room will not be repeated. If it is, I will personally see to it that you spend the rest of your life buried in so much litigation, you'll forget what the sun looks like. Your contract contains non-disclosure and anti-defamation clauses that are, I assure you, utterly ironclad. Do you understand?" I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. "Good," he continued. "This ship is more than just a business, Alex. It is a system. A very delicate, very old system that requires a specific kind of balance. Certain events in its past left a deep impression, an echo, and that echo, for lack of a better term, needs to be managed. It needs to be appeased." "Appeased?" I whispered, the word sounding insane in this sterile corporate office. "Things are kept in a cycle," Davies said, ignoring my question. He looked at the model ship behind him, his expression unreadable. "A routine. As long as the routine is maintained, the system remains stable. The performance, as I'm sure Arthur so theatrically called it, runs its course without incident, and the other 5,000 people on board can enjoy their mojitos and their sunburns in blissful ignorance. The role of the night auditor is the most crucial component of this stability." "You call it a role," I shot back, my anger flaring. "It's a human sacrifice. You're feeding people to this thing." Davies actually smiled, a thin, bloodless slash of his lips. "Don't be so dramatic. It's a job. A very, very well-compensated job. We don't sacrifice anyone. We hire an observer, a regulator, someone to sit in the dark and watch the pressure gauges, so to speak. Your presence, your attention, acts as a grounding rod. You are the sole designated witness. Your observation gives the phenomenon a focal point, a container. Without that, the energy might seek a wider audience. Can you imagine the consequences? The panic, the breach of contract with our guests? This is not malice, Alex. It is management." The cold, pragmatic horror of his words washed over me. He wasn't a villain in a horror story. He was a middle manager discussing a particularly distasteful quarterly report. This ancient supernatural entity was to him a line item on a budget, a recurring operational hazard to be mitigated. "So I'm trapped," I said. It wasn't a question. "Trapped is such an ugly word," Davies countered smoothly. "You have a one-year contract that you signed willingly. If you were to break it, the financial penalties would be severe, and even if you could afford them, what would you do? Walk off the ship at the next port? Go to the authorities, to the press? What would you tell them? A ghost story? You have no proof. Arthur's little diary would be dismissed as the ravings of a disturbed mind. We, on the other hand, have a team of highly paid doctors who would be more than happy to testify that you suffered a psychotic break due to stress and isolation in a maritime environment. We would ruin you, Alex. We would discredit you so thoroughly that your own mother wouldn't believe you. Or you can finish your contract, collect your $500,000, and walk away. Keep your mouth shut and find your replacement, just like Arthur did. It's the circle of life, in a manner of speaking. I stared at him, the full, perfect, inescapable geometry of the cage becoming clear. I was a prisoner, shackled not by iron chains, but by contracts, by money, and by the crushing weight of disbelief. I was a castaway on a ship full of people. Leaving his office was like stepping back into a dream. The cheerful music, the clinking glasses, the bright lights, it all seemed like a paper-thin facade pasted over a roiling abyss. Every smiling crew member I passed looked different now. I saw the deep-set weariness in their eyes, the slight forced curve of their lips. They were all prisoners, just in different sections of the same penal colony. That night, the performance changed. It knew. The ship knew that I now understood my role, and the pretense of random hauntings was over. The waltz did not play. The lady in red did not appear on any camera. Instead, the horror became deeply, exquisitely personal. Around 2 a.m. I did a routine scan of the grand ballroom camera. The room was empty, as it had been all night. I switched to another camera, then, on a gut feeling, switched back a few seconds later. On the small circular table in the corner of the room, a table that was always kept bare and polished, now sat a single perfect long-stemmed red rose. It wasn't a glitch. It wasn't a ghost image. It was a physical object. It hadn't been there 10 seconds ago. My hand shook as I zoomed in. A single drop of what looked like dew glistened on one of its velvety petals. The message was clear. I am not just an image. I can touch this world. I can touch you. Later, the scratching returned to my door, but it was not my mother's voice that called to me. It was Arthur's, a perfect wheezing imitation of the terrified man I had met only once. "She knows you talked to him, Alex," the voice rasped from the hallway. "Bad move. You've made her notice you. You're not just the audience anymore. You're on the program." The final and most terrifying event of the night happened just before dawn. As I sat at my desk, paralyzed with fear, a single sheet of paper slowly, impossibly, slid out from the document feeder of my printer. I hadn't printed anything. It whirred to life on its own. I stared at the paper as it came to rest in the tray. It was the same old yellowed type of paper as the original list of rules. On it, typed in the same distinctive old-fashioned font, was a single new instruction. It was numbered 9. Do not permit yourself to be seen. If you see her with your own eyes, and not through a screen, close them. She must not know you are looking. The entity was giving me new rules. It was rewriting the script, and this new rule implied a terrifying possibility, that I might one day encounter her not as a flicker on a monitor, but face to face in the long, silent corridors of the ship. And my survival would depend on my ability to pretend that I couldn't see the nightmare standing right in front of me. The appearance of rule number 9 changed the fundamental nature of my existence. My life, which had already been reduced to a binary of day dread and night terror, was now governed by a new terrible imperative: the art of not seeing. It was a constant, conscious effort. Walking the corridors during my off hours became an exercise in managed blindness. I learned to keep my gaze fixed on the floor a few feet ahead of me, to study the intricate patterns in the carpeting, to treat the ship's opulent decor as a peripheral blur. I mastered the art of looking without observing, of seeing without perceiving. My world shrank to a tiny, self-imposed bubble of awareness. I became hyper-attentive to reflections. Polished brass fixtures, the glass on framed pictures, the dark, mirrored windows looking out onto the sea. They all became potential traps, surfaces that could betray me with an unwanted glimpse of crimson. I was a man trying to navigate a hall of mirrors with his eyes squeezed shut. The other crew members began to treat me like a leper. They would see me coming down a hallway and abruptly turn, ducking into a service closet or another corridor. They recognized the look in my eyes. It was the same haunted, hunted look Arthur must have worn in his final weeks. I was no longer just the night auditor. I was a marked man, contagious with a fear they were all desperate to ignore. The ship, in turn, seemed to take my new evasiveness as a personal challenge. The performance became more insistent, more tailored. The subtle phenomena of the early nights were gone, replaced by a psychological siege designed to break my resolve. The attacks on my senses became more profound. One evening, the entire service corridor leading to my office became thick with the oily, acrid smell of phantom smoke, a scent so real it made my eyes water and my lungs burn. Another time, I was assailed by the cloying scent of a specific cheap perfume, the kind my grandmother wore, a scent I hadn't encountered since her funeral a decade ago. It filled the elevator, a ghostly presence leaving its olfactory signature, a message that no memory was safe, no sanctuary truly private. The manifestations of the lady in red became more audacious. She was no longer a distant flicker on a screen. The entity was now toying with my new rule, testing its boundaries. One night, while doing my rounds on the monitors, I saw her standing on the stage of the empty theater. But she wasn't just standing there. In her hands, she held a single old-fashioned children's building block with a letter A painted on it. It was identical to one from a set I had owned as a toddler, though set that had been lost in a house fire when I was 5. The entity wasn't just accessing my memories, it was manifesting them, plucking artifacts from the ruins of my past and displaying them like trophies. How could a ghost on a ship know about a wooden block from a life lived 1,000 miles and 30 years away? The question was a venomous hook tearing at the fabric of my sanity. The worst was when it began to manipulate my perception of the ship itself. Corridors that should have been straight would seem to curve slightly at the edge of my vision. I would hear footsteps behind me, only to turn and find the hallway empty and impossibly long, the distance to the far end seeming to stretch into infinity. The ship was no longer a static environment. It was a fluid, predatory landscape, its geometry shifting to disorient and trap me. My only source of solace, if it could be called that, was Arthur's journal. I read it every day, poring over his frantic entries, searching for a pattern, a weakness, a way out that he had missed. It was in his later entries that I found the countdown. He called it the anniversary. He had cross-referenced the date of the maiden voyage tragedy with the ship's current cruise schedule. The final night of that fatal voyage, the night of the captain's gala and the fire, was a date that loomed on the calendar. This year it coincided perfectly with the final night of our current cruise. Entry 184, Arthur had written, his handwriting a barely legible scrawl. It's the anniversary in 3 days. The air is different, thicker. The ship is holding its breath. Last year, the auditor on this contract, a man named Peters, had a complete breakdown on this night. He was found screaming in his office that the walls were bleeding. They sedated him and flew him home from Barbados under medical escort. The company called it a tropical fever. I know what it was. The performance demands a powerful finale. A powerful finale. The words echoed in my mind. The entire nightly ritual was building towards something. A climax. The knowledge settled in my gut like a block of ice. I was on a collision course with the most potent night of the ship's spectral calendar. As the final days of the cruise ticked away, the atmosphere on the ship grew palpably tense. Even the passengers seemed to feel it, a subtle undercurrent of anxiety beneath the forced merriment. There were more arguments, more complaints. The ship's cheerful mask was slipping, revealing the strained, weary face beneath. My own decline was far more rapid. I stopped eating. Sleep was a forgotten luxury. I lived on coffee and adrenaline, my body humming with a constant, low-grade electrical current of fear. My reflection in the mirror was a stranger, a hollow-eyed, gaunt creature with the pallor of a drowned man, and the phenomena escalated relentlessly. One night I returned to the office after a brief trip to the desolate break room to find a photograph placed squarely in the center of my desk. It was a faded Polaroid. In it, a 7-year-old version of myself stood proudly next to a clumsily built snowman. My sister, who was only 3 at the time, was a bundled-up blur in the background. It was a photo from my parents' old album, an album I hadn't seen in years, one I believed was stored in my sister's attic on land. The impossibility of it was a physical blow. I snatched it up, my fingers leaving sweaty prints on the glossy surface. On the back, in faint penciled handwriting, was my mother's familiar script, Alex and Holly, Winter 98. It was real. It was not a copy. It was the photo. My past was no longer just a wellspring for the entity to draw from. It was a physical artifact it could summon and deliver. The message was clear. There is no part of your life I cannot reach. No memory I cannot touch. No wall between your then and my now. Finally, the last day arrived. The ship was abuzz with the cheerful chaos of passengers packing, settling their accounts, and preparing for disembarkation in the morning. For them, it was the end of a vacation. For me, it felt like the eve of my own execution. A profound sense of finality hung in the air. I knew with a certainty that transcended logic that I would either not survive the night, or I would be so irrevocably broken by it that survival would be meaningless. When I entered the office for my final shift, the air was cold and still. The usual hum of the servers seemed muted, subservient to the oppressive silence. I sat at my desk and tried to regulate my breathing, a useless exercise. My heart felt like a trapped bird, beating its wings bloody against the cage of my ribs. I stared at the monitors, watching the ship settle into its nightly slumber, the final lights winking out one by one. I waited for the waltz, for the scent of smoke, for a whisper in the dark. But there was nothing. Only a profound and absolute stillness, an emptiness that was more terrifying than any manifestation. It was the silence of the stage, moments before the curtain rises on the main event. At exactly 3 a.m., my printer whirred to life. My head snapped towards the sound, every nerve ending screaming. Just as it had before, the machine was operating on its own, a puppet animated by an unseen hand. I watched, my breath held captive in my chest, as a single sheet of that same familiar yellowed paper was slowly, deliberately fed through the machine and deposited in the output tray. For a full minute, I didn't move. I simply stared at the impossible object, the final summons. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to stand, to walk the few feet to the printer. I reached out a trembling hand and picked up the paper. On it, in the same stark, typewritten font as the original list and the terrifying Rule Number 9, was the final instruction for the anniversary performance. It was a rule designed not to test my discipline or my courage, but to attack the very core of my humanity. 13. On the final night, at the stroke of 3:33 a.m., the anniversary of the fire, you will hear a knock at your door. A voice will call to you, the voice of someone you cherish. It will beg you for help. You must not open the door. You must not answer. Your survival depends on your ability to betray your own heart. Rule number 13 lay on the desk under the harsh fluorescent light, not as a piece of paper, but as a death sentence. The ink was a condemnation, the yellowed texture a shroud. The clock on my monitor read 3:01 a.m. I had 32 minutes until the final test. 32 minutes to live as the man I had once been, before I was forced to commit the ultimate act of self-betrayal. I'm telling you this now, from whatever hollowed-out place I currently reside, because I need a record to exist. A final log entry. What would you do sitting in this chair in this pressurized silence, with that rule staring back at you? What terrible truth do you think is waiting on the other side of that door? Go ahead, leave your theories in the comments below. Perhaps one of you will guess the shape of the cage before the lock clicks shut. Subscribe, if you have the stomach for it, to witness the final moments of a man's soul. The silence in the minutes that followed was a living entity. The ship's perpetual, deep-throated hum, the sound I had come to think of as its sleeping breath, faded away. It was a slow, deliberate cessation of life, as if the vessel's great heart had ceased to beat. The silence it left behind was not empty. It was pressurized, heavy, pushing in on my eardrums. The lights above me began to pulse in time with my own frantic heartbeat, dimming to a sickly orange and then flaring back to a painful white. A slow, rhythmic, terrifying breath. Then the music began. It wasn't the faint, ethereal waltz from the pool deck. This was a symphony. It erupted from the very structure of the ship, a full phantom orchestra swelling with a terrible, tragic grandeur. It poured from the walls, vibrated up through the floor, and rained down from the ceiling. It was the sound of the captain's gala in its final glorious moments, a tidal wave of memory washing through the vessel's steel corridors. It was beautiful and it was monstrous, the soundtrack to a 60-year-old death. My eyes were glued to the monitors, and on every single screen, the view had changed. The empty casino, the silent theater, the deserted pool deck, all were gone. Every one of my 16 screens now showed the grand ballroom, but not the dark, empty ballroom of my shift. It was the ballroom of the maiden voyage. The room was alive with light, with champagne, with the ghosts of the laughing, dancing dead. Men in crisp tuxedos and women in shimmering gowns swirled across the polished floor in a silent, ghostly ballet. It was a replay of the final party, a visual echo accompanying the auditory one. And I saw her, Annabelle Clayton. She was not a glitch, not a blur. She stood by the grand staircase, a vision of impossible elegance in her blood-red gown. She was not dancing. She was watching the crowd, a faint, melancholy smile on her lips. She was the star of the show, the tragic heroine waiting in the wings for her final scene. But as I watched, her head turned, slowly, deliberately, away from the ghostly revelers. She looked directly into camera 4, directly at me. Her smile did not waver. The message was clear. The overture was finished. The main performance was about to begin. For her, it was a tragedy to be endlessly relived. For me, it was a test to be survived. The clock on my monitor clicked over to 3:33 a.m. As if struck by a giant invisible bell, the entire ship chimed. It was a deep, resonant, bone-jarring bong, a sound that seemed to emanate from the ship's keel and shake every bolt and rivet. And in the deafening silence that followed, there came a knock at my door. It wasn't a spectral, terrifying rap. It was a soft, hesitant, knuckles-on-wood sound, a human sound. It was the most frightening thing I had ever heard. I squeezed my eyes shut, my entire body rigid. My mind was a single, screaming mantra. Don't open. Don't answer. Betray your own heart. Then came the voice. Alex? My blood froze. I knew that voice better than my own. It was the voice of my younger sister, Holly. It wasn't an imitation. It wasn't a mimicry. It was her, perfect in every inflection, every subtle cadence. The sound of her voice in this place was a violation of every law of physics and reason. Alex, please open the door, her voice called again, closer this time, as if she were pressing her face to the wood. There was a tremor of fear in it that felt utterly, agonizingly real. I don't know how I got here. I was asleep, and then I was here. In this long hallway, it's so cold, please, I'm scared. A sob tore from my throat. It was an animal sound of pure agony. This was the test. Not a monster, not a demon, but the perfect weaponized form of my own love. My mind screamed that it was impossible, a trick, a cruel mimicry. But my heart was being ripped in two. That was Holly, my little sister. Scared and alone in the dark, I saw a lady, her voice whimpered, punctuated by a soft, desperate weeping. A lady in a red dress. She pointed to this door. She said you were in here. Alex, please, what's happening? Just open the door. I pressed my fists against my skull, trying to crush the sound, trying to crush my own fracturing mind. The journal's words echoed in my head. Your survival depends on your ability to betray your own heart. I understood now. This was the final filter. It wasn't about courage. It was about whether you could sever the most human part of yourself to save your own skin, whether you could listen to the person you love most in the world beg for help and do nothing. Her pleas grew more frantic. Her small, balled-up fists began to beat against the door. Alex, why won't you answer me? It's me, it's Holly, let me in, I'm scared, Alex. I was crying uncontrollably, my body shaking with violent, silent sobs. I had never felt such a profound sense of self-loathing, such a deep and searing shame. I was a coward, I was a monster. But I was a monster who wanted to live. I stayed in my corner, a wretched ball of terror and guilt, and I did not move. I did not speak. And then it stopped. The crying, the begging, the pounding. All of it ceased in an instant. The silence that followed was absolute. The waltz was gone, the pulsing lights were still. The images on the monitors snapped back to their normal, present-day views of empty, silent corridors. The ordeal was over. As the first faint grey light of dawn began to touch the horizon, a profound exhaustion settled over me, so heavy it felt like a physical weight. I had survived. I had passed the final, cruel test. I had betrayed my own heart, and I was still alive. I spent the next 2 hours in a daze, mechanically going through the motions of closing out my shift. When Maria, the day auditor, arrived, I could barely look at her. I mumbled something about a migraine and fled the office. My only goal was to get to my cabin, pack my single bag, and get off this cursed vessel the second it docked. I would take nothing. I would say nothing. I would simply disappear. I was halfway down the service corridor on deck 3 when a figure stepped out from a doorway blocking my path. It was Mr. Davies. He wasn't in his crisp executive suit. He was wearing a simple, dark work uniform, the kind the senior crew wore. His expression was not angry or threatening. It was calm, serene, almost proud. "An impressive performance, Alex," he said, his voice quiet. "Truly. Not many make it through the anniversary with their faculties intact." "Get out of my way," I snarled, my voice a raw croak. "I'm done. I quit. Keep your blood money." Davies smiled, a knowing, paternal expression that turned my stomach. "Oh, I think you misunderstand the terms of your employment. Passing the test doesn't mean you're free to go. It means you've been promoted." He held up a hand, and in it was a new ID badge, not the temporary one I had been issued. This one was a heavy, permanent-looking card. It had my picture on it. But the title beneath my name was not Night Auditor. It was Night Warden. "Warden?" I whispered, the word feeling alien and heavy on my tongue. "The role of the auditor is a probationary period," Davies explained, his voice smooth as polished marble. "A year-long interview. We need to see if a candidate has the resilience, the fortitude, the ability to make the necessary sacrifices. You have. You've proven you are strong enough to carry the burden." He took a step closer, his eyes locking onto mine. "The ship isn't haunted, Alex. Not in the way you think. It's wounded. The tragedy of that night created a tear in things, a psychic wound that can never heal. Annabelle is its heart. She is a constant looping memory of sorrow. The wound must be contained. If left unattended, it would fester, spread, and consume the entire vessel. It requires a constant conscious human presence to act as a container, a focal point, a warden for the prison of her memory." The full, breathtaking horror of his words crashed over me. "Arthur, he said he found a replacement." "He did," Davies confirmed, "just as his predecessor found him. The position is not for a year. It is a life sentence. You serve until you can find someone desperate enough and strong enough to take your place. You passed the test. You didn't escape the performance, Alex. You've just inherited the lead role." My legs gave out. I slid down the wall, the world spinning around me. This was the final, hopeless truth. There was no escape, there never had been. The job wasn't a cage, it was a contagion, passed from one damned soul to the next. That was 6 months ago. The man named Alex is gone, a ghost who haunts my own memory. I am the Night Warden now. I no longer feel fear. I no longer feel anything at all. I am a part of the ship's machinery, as vital and as soulless as its engines. I watch the performance every night, but it no longer affects me. The waltz is just a sound. The lady in red is just an image. The whispers are just the wind. I am the audience. I am the guardian. I am the cage. And tonight, a new cruise begins. I stand by the gangway in my clean, dark uniform, watching the new crew members come aboard. My eyes scan their faces, searching for the right combination of hope and desperation. And then I see him. A young man, his eyes full of the same anxiety and determination that once filled my own. He's looking for a way out of a life he no longer wants. He thinks he's found his escape. I approach him, the official binder and the thin manila folder held in my hand. I force my lips into a welcoming smile, a perfect imitation of the one that damned me. "Welcome to the serenity of the seas," I say, my voice a calm, dead thing. "Let me show you to your office. The handover is simple.